having solitaire make it worth it for 5 minutes?
Well, I've just uninstalled solitaire.
Solitaire counts as bloat, does it?
Yeah. I don't need a weather app. Why does Windows come with a weather app?
You're going to hand this computer back to the university, and it's just going to be one Word file called mega document with everything in it .doc.
It has Obsidian, it has my email, it has Firefox. That is all that I need. Hello and welcome back to Rails to Nowhere. I'm your host Ella, and I'm joined as always by Simon.
Hello.
Before we start, I will just apologise if you can hear any reverb in the background of my recording. I am currently recording on the road, so as a result, I'm recording a bit of an echoey room because it was very, very hard to find somewhere that wasn't that was a bit better. I have put a towel up on the wall though to try and dampen things a bit. Last episode, we looked at the wider context of the transport mix on the island of Jersey at the turn of the 20th century, and we also looked at the early history of the new company, the Jersey Railways and Tramways Company. We're now going to look at the next part of the company's story, where the company goes on quite the expansion run. This is a series of years characterized by incredible amounts of growth and a lot of investment for the railway too.
Recently, I was in York for a railway studies thing. Hello, railway studies students listening to this. And I was talking to Andy about this, and he was shocked by how much railway the island of Jersey has, or had. And we're only going to be talking about half-ish of the network that existed on the island.
2/3.
Yeah, because there's the other net. There's another company.
Yes, I will briefly
which
summarise.
We touch on, but we're not going to really talk about them because project creep and scope creep. That's the word I'm looking for. And
even scope creep. So the railway that you're talking about, the second one, is the Jersey Eastern Railway. This ran from Snow Hill in St Helier all the way to Goree Pier in Goree, would you believe, up the eastern side of the island. This railway's historical footprint is almost non-existent. There's a couple of documents that remain from the time. However, the most that we know about them is referenced in other companies' documents where they were either having deals with or were being seen as a threat to other companies. So it's very hard to build up much information about them. However, they most certainly did exist. They were a standard gauge railway rather than a narrow gauge one.
It's a tiny island, 2 gauges already.
Yeah.
Actually, were there 3 gauges in it that have been built on the island? Did the Germans use a different gauge during the war?
So there's been the...
Sorry, I'm completely going off track here.
No, it's fine. There was a 60 centimetre gauge. There was a 100 centimetre gauge. There was the 3'6" of the railway we're looking at now. And there was
100 centimetres and 3'6" are so different sizes, you need to have them as different gauges.
Mm-hmm. Well, one was built by the Germans, don't forget.
Yeah, I know, because like 100 centimetres is not actually 3'6". It's actually like 3'4" or something close to that.
Yeah, it's
but they're not very far apart. Too many gauges for such a tiny railway.
Quite interesting. Anyway, yes.
But yeah, so we're gonna bring us back to the Jersey Railway and Tramway, which we were talking about it will be last 2 weeks ago when you're listening to this, if you're listening to it on the day it comes out, because we're holding the two together to come out together.
Yeah. So the JR&T was much more successful than their predecessor. In 1906 and the following 7 years after that, this was a period that was categorized by a massive swathe of reports, investments, and quite high expenditure from the company. During these years, the company was heavily invested in infrastructure upgrades, so new rolling stock and new locomotives. However, much to the ire of a personal friend and friend of the show, Gareth, the quality of the permanent way never really, shall we say, kept up. But that's fine. It's a small island railway. You almost don't expect there to be amazing quality infrastructure because it's run by, as another friend of the show and personal friend Amir describes it, it was run by Keith and his mates in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, that's fairly common on narrow gauge railways throughout the world, even.
Yes,
I mean, I'm working on an episode on the narrow gauge railways of Wales, and like it's very common in Wales as well. In fairness, it's also fairly common on branch lines. I think it's one of those things where, because heritage railways have to exist within the modern safety framework, their track quality is usually not far off of mainline track quality, with the only real difference usually being that they might still use jointed track rather than continuous welded.
Yeah, this is true. I would also argue that the reason heritage railways in the present day are so much better is ultimately there's a limited number of suppliers of rail. A lot of heritage rail is either bought from the same suppliers that Network Rail and other railway companies are buying from, or it sometimes is just surplus rail from Network Rail that is no longer useful to Network Rail's endeavour, but they can effectively put it down as a charitable donation, or for someone like Siemens or Sistra or whoever's working on a project can
because I know
donate that as like a corporate donation. Effectively,
that's sort of where a lot of, as I understand it, where a lot of the sort of bullhead that's in use on a lot of heritage railways comes from is when like they do a re-railing project on a lesser used line. They'll, if it's in decent enough nick, have it sent off to a heritage railway, because heritage railways are obviously very interested in sort of stuff like bullhead because it's historical. It's got value for them as a historical artifact.
The other advantage for them too is that it probably plays better with the rolling stock they're running, because ultimately the rolling stock they're running was designed for bullhead.
Yes.
But this is a bit of a side
We're going on a slight tangent here.
The JRNT brings in an engineer by the name of Ramsay Kendall. He was a North Eastern Railway works manager, and his job was to inspect the line and give an opinion on a series of accidents that had occurred during this time period. Quite interestingly, though, Kendall notes these are actually very ordinary for railways of this scale. He writes in his report that they were nothing more than what are constantly occurring on other railways. The railway would appear to have actually been quite adept at maintaining itself, despite its very minimal attitude towards maintenance and quality of railway, I suppose.
Yeah, I remember seeing a news article from the 80s, way back when a Central Line train came off of Woodford, and some London Transport spokesman foolishly actually said to the press, yeah, well, this happens all the time. And it's like, well, yes, but also you don't say that to the press.
Yeah, you don't say that to the press.
Like, it's less so now. Safety standards have gone up and whatever, but like certainly in the early 1900s, the idea that something falls off every so often, that's just a normal course of events on a railway.
Also, most of the accidents the railway was experiencing were thankfully less related to the quality of track and were instead related to the fact that it was more driver error and poor maintenance of the rolling stock than poor maintenance of the railway. The most common incidents were run-throughs at crossings and at station throats and station ends, where the train would just kind of run through the buffers at the end. Not really good. And the other were boiler failures, where the train just kind of tries to become Cthulhu.
Oh, yeah. I always love a good picture of a spaghettified train.
Yes, there's a bit of spaghetti was made. However, these were common on other lines around the country, both small and large.
And the world,
Yeah, and the world at this time. And the management and Kendall conclude that they're quite adept at what they're doing, considering the context of the time. Mm-hmm. There were discussions at this time around electrifying the railway and converting it fully into a tramway and realising the dream of the Jersey Railways and Tramways Company's name. However, Kendall dismisses this idea, as it would have, in his words, it would have very little value and would not likely increase passenger numbers. It's quite interesting, though, because interurbans are growing at this time. In the UK, the Burton Ashby Light Railway is one of the few interurbans that really get going in the UK. And, of course, in America, the interurban tramway is incredibly common. And I believe at this time as well, we start seeing the rise of the the Belgian snail tram, I think is how you pronounce it, the beach tram.
Oh, okay, I never knew there was a interurban railway.
Yeah, there was in the UK. It was a proper like little interurban.
Yeah,
It's also at this time you get other things like the Wolverton and Stony Stratford Railway.
Other people who don't know, like me, the Burton and Ashby Railway ran from Burton-on-Trent to Ashby-de-la-Zouch in Leicestershire, stopping off with like branch through Swandlecombe. I mean, that looks like it would be a really good thing to have now. There's a fair few places where we could do with like interurban trams now.
There's interesting this though, because Kendall suggested instead that rolling stock improvements and operating practice revisions were needed to modernise the line rather than going for the electrification option. So this would include buying new coaches, obviously, and considering changing how how things like the fact that they don't have signalling is used.
Yeah.
The board would carry out most of these changes. A lot of the passenger wagons that were still good received new bogies, and this, as a result, improved ride quality. And 2 new coaches were ordered too. The bogies are quite interesting because they replaced on some coaches wooden bogies at this point because they were still that old. No track layout changes occurred, however, although that would have helped with the permanent way maintenance and better the rolling stock.
But track is expensive and difficult to
very hard
move.
to reconfigure.
Yeah, I mean, and like thinking back to how they did it, then I remember going to like a permanent, not permanent way. I remember going to a tour of a Heritage Railway depot where they were talking about like how they were needing to slew some track and how much work was just sort of involved in doing that when you don't have like the modern equipment to sort of pick it up and
even the modern
around.
Equipment needs a team of like 40 people to make it go.
Yeah. Oh yeah, even today it's not a small task, but back then when you're just like you think you're moving, I don't know, even just 30 meters of solid iron rail with
and the weight's
just
quite a lot.
Elbow grease, you are talking like, I mean, go look on YouTube. There's plenty of archive footage on YouTube of sort of old style permanent way works, and we are talking one person every sort of 50 centimeters or so to try and just shimmy a bit of rail a couple of centimeters.
Yeah, lots of shovels, lots of cheetah bars, and not easy, so pry bars. There were some other purchases made at this time too. A new locomotive, numbered number 5 and named Lamoy, was ordered to help cope with the steeper gradients on the line, especially those down towards the Corbière branch. This locomotive is quite interesting, actually, because it was built by Hunslet Barclay, really nice locomotive. It was unusual in that it had square windows and had a much larger boiler than the rest of the locomotives on the line, but that's because it was designed for steeper gradients, so it needed the abilities to develop more steam. This locomotive would work until 1928, when it was sold to the Victoria Falls Power Company in what is now South Africa. It's assumed that this happened. It's not really given why they did this, but it's assumed that because of the efficiency of some later purchased rail cars and the high fuel demands of the locomotives, it was sold on. And works reports and manager notes from the time don't survive into this to this day, so it's actually quite hard to kind of work out what's happened. There's a little extra note. This locomotive does, in theory, still exist in South Africa. It was last heard about in about 2010 era, I believe, where some islanders were trying to bring it back from a South African rail museum that was unfortunately under threat of scrappers trying to just nick stuff that they had, and unfortunately we don't really know what's happened. I have an idea of where it might be, but I have not the funds nor the ability to visit South Africa, so unfortunately this will be an unanswered question.
It's interesting because I know that, because I was wondering, because I know a lot of sort of stuff that got exported got re-imported by a couple of people as well, because folks like the North Wales Festiniog have imported a few South African things, but they've generally imported sort of more mainliney stuff that's at 15-inch gauge.
Yes.
But then the Stafford Barnes Railway has also re-imported a lot of British-built narrow gauge locos from a lot of places.
Yes, it's a bit of a
well worth a visit if you want to go and just look at sort of interesting steam, narrow gauge steam trains.
Finally, on the modernisation note, the railway tested out electric lighting. This is to replace gas and candle setups. It was purchased from the J. Stone and Company in Deptford, in London, obviously. The system used a dynamo and coach axles and also had provision for a head and tail lamp on the train. The trials proved to be very successful, and a full fit-out of the entire fleet was ordered in September 1913. Very few systems at this time were actually lit by electric light. The railways like the Metropolitan in London would remain unlit in the coaches with dim gas lights at stations in this period.
And BR would continue to use oil lamps for its tail lights for decades after this.
Yeah. And it was very much, electric light was very much seen as the lighting of the future. And this was exploited elsewhere as a feature, like Yerkes, as we saw with UERL. He loved to have
conversations of that in our last series.
Yes, big electric lights to entice people in to say this is the system of the future. So the railway is doing quite well at this time, and we hit the real years of success now between 1919 and 1929.
So I find this interesting that this is labelled the success years because, as we have discussed previously, the post-First World War 1919 onwards period is not necessarily something you can call a successful period for a lot of railways.
No.
So I find it interesting that this is where we find the peak of success for this rail company.
Yeah, well, I find it quite interesting because, as you say, like in Britain, for example, we have the start of the real collapse of the existing system on British railways, where you get the consolidation into the big four.
Yep.
And we, as we've discussed previously, we get this kind of fight to show how much glamour and so on that they have. But when you actually boil it down to the day-to-day gritty experiences of people, the railways in Britain are actually pretty bad unless you are on one of a handful of top elite services designed to look good on a poster.
By and large, the UK rail network peaks in 1914, just in the lead up to the First World War, and then declines sharply after the outbreak of the First World War for various reasons. We'll talk more. I think we will talk more about the war and the railways, both wars and the railways at a later date. But
yes, they are.
You can go back and listen a little bit to our episode about the grouping and about Geddes, which touch a little bit on that.
Yeah, it's easy to go and listen. I think it's worth listening to. This trend, however, is bucked by the Jersey Railways and Tramways Company. These years, 1919 to 29, are the most prosperous years of the railway. They have record passenger numbers, record income receipts, record rolling stock counts, and innovation that was watched by the world over, actually. At this time, I alluded to this earlier, the railway purchases a set of 3 Sentinel Camel rail cars. Now, rail cars are not new at this point, but at this point, a lot of them are just, we took a steam locomotive and a passenger carriage and kind of glued them onto the same chassis. These are a little more, should we say these are a little more thought through than that. The Sentinel Camel rail cars are often known for their use on the London North Eastern railways. Indeed, if you go looking, most pictures of them are on the LNER. However, the Jersey Railways and Tramways were the launch customer for these rail cars. The first order showed up in December of 1922, which was a total of £1,800 quoted for it. This car was known as Pioneer. However, it gets quite interesting because they run a few trials, and on the 29th of June 1923, these trials were watched by a press pool. This press pool was quite unique in that, while yes, there were rail dignitaries from Britain, some European railways also came over to visit, but the audience also had people from as far away as Mexico in North America.
Oh.
By the time the second car arrived, that's car number 2, the interest had reached as far as the Australian Commonwealth Railways, who sent their consulting engineer over also to have a look at these cars and validate them if they'd be useful for the Australian Commonwealth Railways, which indeed they were. They also purchased them off the back of this. These cars were quite modern. They had the latest in styling, incorporating elements of the Art Deco movement into their design, and they also incorporated early streamlining looks, which would come to dominate as the 1930s got underway. This was in stark contrast to their Victorian stock, which was mostly wooden or body on frame, hauled by a very obvious steam locomotives.
I'm being distracted now looking at pictures of Sentinel rail cars all over the world, because they appear to have got everywhere.
Yeah, they did go everywhere, and these guys were the pioneers of them. Quite interestingly,
these are steam rail cars, aren't they?
Yes, these are steam rail cars.
At least for the JRT, they're steam.
No, all the Sentinel ones are steam.
Are they all steam?
The JRT were incredibly confident with the design that they had bought, and the management were incredibly pleased, saying that the design would eventually be taken up by all the light railways in the world, and they would be able to look back to Jersey as the pioneer of the new coach. And I think we can do that.
They feel very bullied leader-esque, though, in the aesthetic of it looking very much like a diesel unit, but it actually being steam powered. Now, I'm aware that these are not like massive steam turbine things like the leader was, but yeah, these have that same sort of vibe of some steam motors look very old-fashioned. Some of them very much look like they've just got a locomotive bolted directly to a carriage. These ones, they're very Art Deco. They look really like they almost look like a Derby lightweight in terms of styling.
Yes, I see elements.
BR DMUs.
Yeah, well, I see elements of modern rail car design in them. They feel very early kind of multiple unit styling. These couldn't work in multiple, sadly, but they could haul coaches should they have to. But I think they very much were an early look at where railways and passenger railways, especially on quieter lines, would eventually end up with things like, as we move on into British Rail's history, the Derby lightweights, and later on even things like your Sprinters and Pacers, and even now with Turbostars. I think the DNA is certainly in there for a unit that is self-contained with a self-contained method of propulsion.
And looking to the British mainland at around the same time, like in parallel to these, we've got push-pull consists being come up with by the Great Western.
And the Great Western has their motors.
The LMS has some push-pulls as well, but the Great Western with its auto coaches is the most well-known, certainly, with their push-pull auto coaches, and then onto their single and then multiple vehicle rail motors, or the Flying Bananas as they're sometimes called, which really prove the ground for like that sort of self-contained train and prove the DMU concept very early on. But it's interesting seeing how we're, because I think we're at that point where it's still the internal combustion engine still hasn't quite matured enough to actually be usable for a train, or be confidently usable for a train at this point. So we're at that weird boundary of the technology.
We're at the intersection.
Yeah, it's a really interesting period of sort of rail innovation at this point.
Yeah, I think they're really interesting coaches, to say the least. However, the cars would eventually succumb to a similar fate that most of the modern stock for British Rail had. As noted by the 1963 Beeching report, the new stock for British branch lines supplied under the 1955 modernisation plan didn't actually help the lines in the long term, especially as these were withdrawn due to lower patronage numbers and they were replaced with bus routes. This would actually happen with these cars too. They would eventually be replaced with bus routes, but that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Also, as we've said, these are steam rail cars, and as a result, they have quite poor performance compared to later diesel models. So as a result, they'd rarely go beyond St. Auban, because that's where the flattest part of the line was, between St. Helier and St. Auban.
Yeah, because you struggle to fit a big...
Yeah.
You don't get a lot of tractive effort out of a steam rail motor, because you don't have very many drive wheels.
Yes, and because of their poor power-to-rate ratios, they barely ever went to Corbière apart from a few trial runs and in the absolute most desperate of circumstances. These rail cars, you can see them as the end of the modernisation attempts for the railways. However, this isn't the end of the success years. The railway would also buy the New Jersey Motor Transport Bus Company.
There we go. Here's the
Yes.
secret.
So this company, the Jersey Motor Transport, was seen as a threat to the JR&T by the management of the JR&T, as it operated in direct competition with the JR&T route. The company acknowledged the threat of the motor bus during a speech at their celebratory lunch for marking the railcar's success a few years after they came in. However, it's quite an interesting story, I think, what happens. So the railcars are not much bigger than a bus of the period capacity-wise. However, they do have lower running cost and a smaller capacity that gave more frequent service on the core St Helier to St Auburn route. It's also not unusual for railways to own and operate buses at this time too. Dyos and Aldcroft note this, that there is increasing interest of outright ownership of, or being at minimum a majority stakeholder in bus companies that are around railway companies at this point. By 1933, railway companies in Britain had sunk 13.5 million into bus operations to try and combat the threat.
Jesus Christ.
So this is where the bus operations on Jersey get quite interesting too, because the JR&T initially started with feeder buses, which is actually quite a modern concept as we see it now.
Yeah, it's a very advanced concept of transportation. Like we see it in, we talked about this in the LT episodes we did, but really you don't see feeder buses properly happening in London until this period. So it's actually, that's really interesting, because that means that the JR&T is basically at the cutting edge of thinking in terms of how you do urban transport. I know Jersey isn't necessarily urban, but like there's bits of it that are semi-urban at the very least.
And it's quite interesting because these feeder buses...
That is very interesting.
Yeah. Well, they operate in the west of the island, mostly feeding into St Auburn and the St Auburn area from surrounding villages in that area.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they were actually a massive success. They started up in 1923, and in 1924's AGM, they were highly praised. They would increase passenger traffic by a whopping 138,000 passengers in 1924 alone. The previous 5 years had only seen an increase of 151,000. It's not known the exact breakdown, but through ticketing on these buses meant that passengers could board in St Helier, take the train to St Auburn, and then join a bus all the way out to St Brelade without having to buy a separate ticket, which obviously is better for the passenger in cost terms, and also great for the company because it means there's only one person they're going to and giving their money to.
Yes, makes your administration much easier.
Yeah, well, this also means for the company they've got a wider customer base available to them because the minimal infrastructure investment with buses, but then you can reach more people. And as St Helier is the main settlement on the island, it helps to be able to get people to and from there.
Yeah.
So up to this point, these buses have been operated by the Jersey Railways and Tramways directly. In 1923, the Jersey Motor Transport, as we talked about earlier, would appear, and as they were seen as a threat, as the JMT was seen as a threat by the JR&T, the JR&T would reduce the fares across its network a week before the JMT would start service to try and prevent customer flight. This wasn't the most successful thing, however, for the railway, it would turn better. In 1928, a merger was proposed and the JMT was purchased outright. And in the 1929 AGM, the managers rationalised this by saying that the board took advantage of the proposals made in order to extend transport services throughout the island, and it organised on an economic basis rail and road traffic of the two companies. The managers would also say it's confidently believed that cooperation between the two companies will be of advantage to the island and to all its visitors. And I think this is true.
Yeah, I struggle to disagree with that logic. I mean, that's the sort of cases I would make today. It is very hard to disagree with that logic.
Well, it's the same logic as used by people like the London Transport Committee.
Yep.
And it's why you see London Transport get consolidated into what it becomes, is because it makes sense to have one operator serving an area.
Yeah.
However, unlike a lot of London services, they're not as connected to the government. Instead, they are entirely privatised.
Yes.
But this isn't uncommon in more rural settings where there's less government interest in transit.
No.
So while there is this logic that the cooperation will be a benefit, unfortunately, it wasn't such of benefit to the company. These bus services would continue to be a threat to the JRT. Just before they were purchased in 1928, the gross receipts had fallen, with passenger numbers dropping by 18% between 1925 and 28, which is the largest drop since the First World War.
That is quite significant.
Yes, it is very significant. Furthermore, the Jersey Eastern Railway, the other railway on the island that we talked about earlier, would cease to operate in 1929. It's not exactly known why, because, as I say, the documents don't survive.
Presumably
but
they're undergoing similar challenges.
Yes, they were unfortunately undergoing similar challenges in the east with the safety coach service, and the JER services were dropped because they just were no longer profitable. Yeah. Interestingly, at this point, Jersey does have two bus operators. In the west, you've got the JMT, who are under the JR&T's care, and in the east, you've got the safety coach service, and they effectively cartelised to carve the island in half at St Helier. And that is partly
to
why.
an extent, the railways had done prior to this.
Yeah, they had effectively done that. This is all in keeping with wider shifts in public transport at this time. As we've discussed in prior episodes, UERL services in London would attempt to integrate with the London General Omnibus Company to form the Combine. Yep. And obviously this had similar benefits to the JR&T service, as you got through ticketing and so on. Eventually, you would see the London stuff obviously come under the London Passenger Transport Board in 1933. And as Simon's noted, there's also the threat of the automobile at this time. Trams were swapped out for trolley buses at this time by the LPTB, and other attempts are made to solve traffic, rather unsuccessfully. But they try. Yeah,
and that's a running theme across many urban areas and many rail companies at this time, as we've discussed at length in the previous series.
And on Jersey, a car is even more justifiable than it would be in London, because Jersey is a lot more ruralised, and at this time farmers are starting to buy tractors, motor mechanised tractors. This is not just using horses for what they want to get done. And the tractor and later cars, as they become more and more affluent, meant that it was easier to own a car and just drive into town rather than having to timetable around buses and trains. So we're now going to move into the final years of the railway, between 29 and 36. So these years, between 1929 and 1936, are dominated by a stark fall in revenue, and passenger numbers drop to all-time lows, even lower than that in the First World War. By this point, the railway is started to be seen as quite antiquated. Diarist and Jersey Evening Post journalist Leslie Sinell wrote in 1942, just after the Germans opened up a new railway system on Jersey to aid their occupation of the islands. The Germans declared that the opening of the railways was a good thing. It was that they would run round the island and eventually be used for the transport of civilians and not just for military purposes. However, he also says that he's quite surprised. He expresses surprise in this because he saw the trains as being out of date in his diary. And this out-of-date feeling, it was felt everywhere across the network, actually. Little improvements to the railway and service were made since the purchase of the rail cars. During their final years, the operating margin was about 1.1% of profit, which is not great if you're trying to run a railway. And the directors' interest had shifted focus. They were no longer caring about the JR&T, and instead were really into the JMT, the buses. And the buses took up most of the talking points at the 1932 annual dinner. This was even expressed in the tableware at the dinner, where everything was decorated in the green and cream of the Jersey motor transport, and the Jersey railways and tramways were kind of left on the side.
No, I find that very interesting, how the JMT is becoming much more sort of the focus of things. It does tie in very much with this sort of same trend we're seeing throughout the country, as sort of like the motor transport being seen as the way forward, the better thing, and having it being easier to make profitable, because as we talked like all over the place, you see this because it doesn't have the same fixed infrastructure costs that a railway does, even when you're maintaining it as substandardly as the JRT is. A bus you just put on a public road, which you pay a little bit of road tax for, but that's not anywhere near as much as the cost of maintaining your own private infrastructure.
Yes. And it gets even worse in many ways for the Jersey Railways and Tramways. They eventually rent their buses to their subsidy, the JMT. So those feeder buses that used to run into St Auburn from St Brelade and other places were now being used by the JMT to run in direct competition with their railway. By 1934, the buses were totaling over 1.37 million miles in total distance travelled, which is a lot. Double-decker Leylands would also appear on the island in 1931, and they became the new face of modern transport on Jersey. No investments would occur on the railway since the central rail cars appeared, and as a result, it started to look antiquated.
This feels like a terrible policy. I don't know, because I mean, maybe you can correct me I don't know if you found records that say on this or not, but this feels very much like the sort of policy that's been adopted to be able to continue paying a regular dividend to shareholders and stuff.
It does feel
just
that way.
like we're losing business, and either we go out of business, or essentially, effectively, what we become is a Roscoe in essence, and we just sort of own some buses and lease them to the JMT, and then our income just comes from that lease rather than actually running the service, which I guess in a way is a more stable, to an extent it's a more stable business option for them, because your expenditures are much more stabilised under that. But it feels very much like it feels very much like a sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face type policy.
Yes. And I would agree with that, because the rental between 1931 and 32 caused the Jersey Railways and Tramways revenue to drop by nearly 69%, from £14,000 down to, well, £14,500 down to just £4,500. This also causes a massive hit to passenger numbers, because there's no longer incentive to take the railway.
Yeah, because if the bus goes straight through to where you want to go and you'd have to buy a different ticket to get on the train, why not just stay on the bus?
Well, this is true. And during this time, the Jersey Motor Transport Company saw a massive increase in revenue and passenger numbers, would you believe? Passengers were no longer with the railway and instead were just riding the buses. But this trend isn't unique to Jersey at this time. By the 1930s, local railway companies were often no longer able to support or even seen as the most technically advanced form of transit in their public eye. And the London Passenger Transport Board shows this very clearly when they switch from trams to trolley buses. And their advertising really plays into this, because despite not running horse trams for a long time, they still advertise the trams, which are symbolised with horse trams, as being replaced by new trolley buses.
As we talked, I think we touched on in some of our episodes on the London Transport, I can't remember if it made the cut or not. I think it's Glasgow and I think Leeds are the only places in Britain that invest in a new fleet of tram vehicles in this period. London looks at and gets a couple of prototype Feltenham trams, which are heavily based off, I believe, the Leeds tram cars of the period. And it refurbishes a variety of vehicles up to that standard or towards that standard. But even in London, there is not investment in new tram cars in this period. So, yeah, as you say, this is very common across tram systems and light railways across Britain and other parts of the world, where you've got ageing rolling stock. There isn't the capital to do the investment to improve it at this stage, and so really the only option is to allow it to wither away and die in essence.
Yeah, and I mean, this I would call in many ways was a period of desperation for a lot of railway companies. Steam railways obviously didn't offer, especially the local ones, didn't offer much in the way of interest through technical advancements, power, speed, and novelty. There were highly mature technologies that just you can't really reinvent the wheel once it's been perfected.
No.
And that's what these railways represented in many ways. They were pretty good at what they did. Larger railways were able to try and appeal to people through investing in an image of modernity. I mean, things like streamlining, air conditioning, and other amenities started appearing on the top expresses for things like the Flying Scotsman on the LNER, and even with things like the Manhattan Limited with the Pennsylvania Railroad's T1. Very much it feels, yes, we are developing this new powerful thing because look how cool it is, but it feels like they're trying to claw back an image of modernity and being on top in the face of buses and especially the automobile.
And to sort of wind back a couple of conversation points, I feel like it doesn't always look like it when you look at it, but I feel like stuff like The Leader is sort of the pinnacle of that because it's the last desperate attempt of the steam diehards to dress steam traction up in the apparel of the modern internal combustion engine vehicle in a last desperate hope to sort of make it last and make it have a place in the future world that's emerging. And I find it interesting you've brought that up because I think that thinking about it, it's not necessarily something I've thought very hard on, but I do think you're right there when you sort of say that actually a lot of the rail companies are, because I've always thought of it, but they are actually innovating, they are actually improving, they are actually being more modern, and to an extent they are, but actually you're right, I think, in saying that actually also what's going on is they're just desperately trying to not innovate, trying not to have to bring in new stuff and actually just stick a bit of paint over and make what already exists look more modern. And again, I think, like Leader, another classic example of that would be, for example, the Flying Scotsman, which gets continually rebuilt from A1 to A2 to A3 by the Great Northern, and then LNER subsequently, as it gets, essentially, we're just sort of trying to make our top express locomotives sort of just rebuild them rather than actually come up with something new. We're just sort of...
And I would argue the streamliners in particular really represent this because the streamlining, it generally is agreed now that it had very little effect on the aerodynamics characteristics beyond what a steam locomotive already had. Ultimately, they're not very aerodynamic things, no matter how much metal you put on it. It's a big brick going through the air at the end of the day.
There's loads of stuff underneath it.
There's all sorts underneath it that ruin it.
Streamlining works because you can put a big box, like if you look at something like a HST or a 225 or a Shinkansen, the bottom is all like boxed in because that does you really good aerodynamics. The problem with like a steam train is you can't box in all the running gear and stuff, so you're still, however smooth you might try and make the top, you've still got all that air turbulence and drag being generated within all of the mechanical running parts underneath.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that as the war starts really kicking off, and then post-war as well, the streamlining gets lost from a lot of these locomotives and never gets fully put back on because actually it was more of a hindrance to the crew's ability to do their job. And also it's just a hindrance to being able to run an effective and efficient system. If you're having to take an hour to oil a locomotive versus 20 minutes because you've got to undo a load of doors and put them all back on, what are you going to do as a company but go, actually, this just isn't worth our time or effort? And as a result, we see it being stripped off. And it's why I would actually argue that it's not so much a modernist thing as it is a trying to appear modernist.
Yes.
This isn't to say that some things they did bring in weren't bad ideas. I will say air conditioning is something that I'm still shocked does not get fitted to more trains. It's an absolute crime that they ordered the 376s without air conditioning in the year 1990, whatever it was.
Units.
Yeah, like it's incredible how some things that are objectively good still get ignored. But overall, I would argue that the JR&T is it's succumbing to the same problems that other railways are at this time. And the buses also provide much greater flexibility. A bus can serve people directly at their doorstep and at the destination. They're not bound by physical infrastructure that has to be maintained, as we've said before, and you can just kind of redirect them as and when you need to. So it's a convenience factor, and I think it's what drove down the JR&T's profit, and I think it's a trend that is reflected across the UK as a whole.
Yep, I can't disagree with you on that one.
Yeah. So as we've seen, the railway just became unprofitable over time. Ridership fell, and the bus concern was taking off at such a speed, it took up all the interest of the management. But it didn't kill the railway. The railway kept on just about by the skin of its teeth, still running a train every half an hour up and down the beachfront. However, this would sadly not last. The fate of the railway was sealed in October of 1936. The railway shut down over winter during this period, as it had done for several years now, to try and cut costs. Instead, they ran replacement buses.
Yeah.
The St Auburn station was used as a stabling point for most of the rolling stock. This is the traditional rolling stock, that is, not the rail cars, as the rail cars required warm storage to keep them in working order. However, in 1936, in October, a fire would unfortunately rip through St Auburn station, and it destroyed much of the terminal building and all of the traditional rolling stock that was stored there for winter. If you go and watch the Railnatter episode I did with Gareth on this, you can see a screenshot, a photograph of the newspaper showing this, and it is quite destructive. I was going to say, these are also wooden cars still, so as a result, they burn very easily compared with more modern steel and other modern construction.
It's a common tale for these sort of less profitable narrow gauge lines. It's not universal by any means, but very common that you'll find that one station somewhere on the line, maybe a shed, something like that, something burns down, and that is basically just the end, because at that point the damage is just too great to be able to afford to fix it. I think even the Liverpool Overhead Railway has one of its termini catches fire, and it struggles or never does rebuild it. I can't remember. I think they have a fire. I know it does a lot of damage to them. I can't remember whether they never rebuild or whether it just takes them ages to get it rebuilt.
Yeah, it's hard to know, I think, but it's a common tale.
Yeah.
But also, I mentioned that the rail cars aren't there and they're stored up at St Helier in the locomotive works. So you're probably asking, why didn't the railway go, well, we've lost our traditional rolling stock, so the summer service might be hard, but we can at least still use the 3 rail cars we own. However, they decide not to. There's no mention since the fire of any attempts ever being made to restore the service, at least in the board meetings and memos that survive. They would eventually sell off the St Helier terminal to the Jersey Motor Transport Company, in turn that becomes a bus station. And that was also seen by the managers of the railway as a huge boon to local traffic in the area. A classic story of the 1930s automobile-focused language of the time. And this wasn't just because of the improvements to traffic flow around St Helier, but also elsewhere up and down the line. The line was effectively entirely, apart from a couple places, all at grade, and there was lots of at grade crossings which would stop cars and slow people down.
So we're seeing very interesting parallels there. You've already drawn on them to the tramways debate on the mainland of sort of like, well, when the tram stops in the middle of the road, it causes traffic problems. And it is, so again, we're seeing the motor car is important, and we need to just get this old, outdated thing out of the way of the modern technology and the modern travel.
Yeah, it's quite sad in a way, but I think it's also quite understandable why the company eventually decides to wind up in this method. The JMT had 168% greater passenger revenue compared to the JR&T, so it was just more profitable. It could run all year round, and it just was a much more sensible operation to keep with as a company.
Yeah.
So the Jersey Railways and Tramways Company decided to wind up their assets and sold nearly all of it off to the state's liquidator, which is effectively part of the island government that deals with shutting down companies. The Jersey Motor Transport Company would continue on, however, until the late 1990s, where it received a bus subsidy from the local government, and eventually the local government decided it was going to franchise bus services on the island. These bus services eventually would move to Connex after the JMT failed to put in a successful bid. And later on, there would be a scandal surrounding the Connex service. And then eventually it would move to now, where Liberty Bus is the present day operator, operating effectively the same routes the JMT drew up with the JRT back in the 1930s and 20s. And that kind of concludes our story. But I think there's a little more here.
Yep.
To talk about.
I see on the script the phrase concluding remarks.
Yes, I think it's quite interesting to look at here. And I'm going to quote directly from my dissertation on the topic, and maybe we'll have some thoughts about this together. The Jersey railways and tramways, they demonstrate a dichotomy facing many railways during the early 20th century. The fight for a profitable system as compared with a system that has modern appearances and fitted with modern sensibilities. Throughout its history, the railway was continuously battling to cultivate an image of a technically advanced and modern system, investing in some of the latest technologies available. These would include electric lighting, the integrated bus operations, and those rail cars. But they were also highly experimental and on the cutting edge of development. This would attract global interest from London to Europe to Australia, and railway managers and engineers would flock to sample these experimental rail cars and other technology. They were also not just an example of technical experimentation, but also an example of experimental architectural work. St Helier's station would fuse traditional Victorian architecture with the relatively young modern arts and crafts movement, and the railway, like its larger counterparts, was making decisions to appear as modern, cutting edge, and highly advanced as the large ones on the mainland. Where the LNER, Pennsylvania, and LMS would go on to build mammoth locomotives in the streamlined modern style, the JRT adopted the design quite early on with the little rail cars. Despite these innovations and experiments, the railway was never able to truly modernise. While the rail cars offered a modern external appearance, they were still fundamentally the tried and tested steam traction. No amount of smooth streamlining and clever design could hide this fact at the end of the day. They still smoked and steamed like a locomotive would. Much like the larger railways of Britain, Europe and America, the JRT fell victim to the automobile and the motorbus, with passengers choosing personal convenience over the railways. I'd also argue that it was a victim of its own success. The purchase of the Jersey Motor Transport Bus Company and the latest successes this company would find, especially after the JRT transferred their buses to them, made the operation of the railway in the final years expensive, and it just reduced passenger numbers to an all-time low. Despite this, the purchase of the JMT can also be seen as quite a success for the railway. They were able to cut a competitor out of the market and instead forced them into working for the railway and eventually providing the railway and shareholders a profitable exit when the railway became uneconomical to rebuild after the fire. The JMT does, however, continue to go from strength to strength, as I say. I think that the fundamental failure of the JRT was caused by the technical progressions in road transport. The line would lose out under the weight of competition from the buses and the private automobile. Light railways and tramways would begin to close in the 1930s, with nearly every system in Britain closed by the 1950s. Buses were up to 80% cheaper to operate per vehicle mile, so it's no wonder why the JMT was so competitive even when under the JRT ownership. Double-deckers, pneumatic tyres and better engines further helped to sap customers from the ailing railway. And this is repeated across the country, across the United Kingdom and even across Europe and America. The JRT would also suffer in a similar way to many of the former British Railways branch lines. Investment into modern rolling stock to great fanfare was made, yet ridership ultimately failed to remain sustainable and the service was eventually withdrawn to passengers, and even to freight despite great capital expenditure. Private cars and motorcycles also had an effect. Personal transport became more and more accessible. The car was such an integral part of Jersey life by 1940 when the German occupation began and the car was banned by occupiers. The relative scarcity of the bicycle and horse-drawn vehicles caused them to fetch extraordinary prices at auction because the car was so popular.
I mean, I think that kind of sums it up fairly well. I would say, see, this is the thing, is we come back to the same thing I said for the London trams, is that there's a bit of me that wants to believe that had they made one or maybe two decisions subtly differently to what they actually did, that it could have survived. There's that bit of me that wants to say, oh, if they'd adopted electric traction tramway operations, modernised down that road, then that would have saved them, because we know that the electric traction road was ultimately the more successful long-term modernisation route than steam traction was. But equally, actually, like with the London trams, whilst there's that bit of me that wants to say, oh, well, if they'd just made this decision different, they would have survived. The thing is, all the other tramways in Britain made the decision to adopt electric traction. And many of them did it about that same time, sort of 1909 through to, well, I guess they would have been making the decision slightly later in the 1919 to 1929 period. Most British tramways made that decision before the First World War, and most had completed it before the First World War. But yet they still all closed. And so it's like, well, I don't know how I could even begin to rationalise the idea that somehow the Jersey Railway would have been the one other standout case alongside the Blackpool Tramway to somehow manage to buck that trend. So I think it's interesting, because you can sit here and you can go, oh, well, what about alternative histories where they made these decisions and things went differently? And it's like, well, actually, probably they would have, maybe that would have kept them going until the later into the 30s, maybe into the 40s. But ultimately, also, we have to remember the complexities of the islands being invaded and all sorts during the war. And I think you can run away with the sort of alternative history, and you sort of create this world where maybe it achieves the same thing the Isle of Man does, that it lives on just long enough that interest in sort of preserving it and running it as a heritage operation manages to keep it into the present day. But I think realistically, this is one of those places where, certainly at the time that we're talking about, the bus just fits so much better into the niche of what the island needs for its transport purposes than a tram and especially a steam train could provide. And so it's not, I don't think it's viable. I don't think there's really a route I could see where any of these sort of flashpoints, if they'd made a different decision, I think maybe it had the potential to sort of extend things a little bit further, but I don't think it would have. I don't think there's any sort of world where this railway sort of manages to survive.
No.
And I think it's an interesting little microcosm of all those issues. It's really, really interesting little case study.
I think also another thing as well with Jersey is that the government itself is not interested in maintaining this thing. The Isle of Man is unusual in the government steps in to run what is effectively a pair of museums.
Yes.
The Isle of Man Railway in its current form, the steam railway and the Manx Electric, are very much perceived as heritage operations. They have museums. Their entire goal is to provide a tourist interest on the island rather than a legitimised transport service. Now, this isn't to say there aren't people who do use it as a legitimate transport service, but as a service in the present day, and even as it goes back through history, they are very much moving very quickly to turn it into heritage operations rather than keep it as a legitimate, this is how you can get around the island. And I think Jersey's government is very much not interested in running public transport, be them buses or trains. Ultimately, they give money to the JMT up until the early 2000s to keep the buses going. But then they tender them off, franchise them out to Connex, and that goes about as well as any time Connex has touched a bus network.
Yep.
But I think there's some interest here that we can actually, some thoughts we can draw out for the modern day on Jersey.
Yep.
Jersey has notoriously poor traffic. The island wants to reduce its dependence on the car, yet it has done very little to reduce this. They've stated several times that they want to look at how they can solve traffic, cut down on car miles on the island, but nothing has really worked. New vehicles are being registered on the island at a rate of nearly 900 a year, further compounding the issue, while bus usage has massively decreased. The island is also home to the only dual carriageway on a Crown dependency. The A2 from St Helier to about halfway round the bay is a dual carriageway, and it clogs up every day with traffic. And I think one has to actually wonder if a new tramway or railway of some description would actually be of value to help combat this problem. The population is mostly concentrated along that old railway route, at least until Donbridge, which is now Lequinavay, but that area. The states could embrace the strong heritage provided by the JR&T and that forward-looking ethos of the company with the looks for modern traction and even electrification, and build on the past to help meet their current goals, both with traffic and also in response to the ongoing climate crisis that they keep saying they're trying to help with too. They can invest in a modern railway system, be it a tramway, be it a railway, be it some in between. I'm not quite sure what would be the best fit, but that's for them to work out, I think. And they could help even potentially build the next generation of what you would term light rail. But that's a story for another day, I think. But
yeah,
I don't know.
You touch a little bit more on that in the Rail Natter episode that you
Yes,
did
we Gareth and I discussed some potential routings, that sort of thing, because
so
you also have the airport.
More sort of theoretical. What could a second generation Jersey railway look like? Or I guess it'd be third generation because the second generation would be the German railways.
Yes.
But what could a modern generation tram system for Jersey look like? Then do look up the episode Ella did with Gareth over on Rail Natter.
I think there's actually a lot of interest, though, in building on their heritage because the company has a rich history of wanting to see the future, and Jersey itself likes to see itself as a modern, forward-thinking society trying to solve the modern problems.
And this
so actually
fits into that narrative.
Yeah, it would really fit and play
maybe
into
not
that narrative.
But they were trying to solve those problems.
Yeah, and we see now there's so much need for alternatives to the automobile. So maybe it's time to consider an alternative to their kind of ailing bus network and the massive amounts of automobile traffic.
Yeah.
But I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you thought it was interesting. I actually need to say some thank yous for this, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I need to issue a massive thanks to Dr. Martin Frampton and Dr. Rodri Hayward of Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Hayward was my supervisor for this project, and without him, it really wouldn't have worked. And as I say, also Martin was very helpful in proofreading parts of it and just generally being a nice person to talk to about it. I also need to send a massive thanks to Dr. David Turner of the University of Aston, or Aston University, as he met with me a couple of times and we discussed some ideas and some potential pointers for this. He was really helpful, and I really hope that he finds this interesting too, because I know he does listen to this while he's gardening. So
yes, I was talking to him about that in
I hope you
August.
Yep. And as for the future, we will see what happens.
Yeah, I've got some plans for a couple of episodes coming up. I've got a couple of, I know they listen. Hello, people who listen, who I've promised to email.
Hello.
I will do this. It may probably be into the new year that we manage to get that sorted. But yeah, we've got a couple of things on the cards. What the future holds for us is going to be interesting because Ella has after a year break after her MA, she's now moved on to doing a PhD. So
more to follow.
we are recording this on the 21st of September 2024, which is the end of Ella's first week of her PhD.
It's hard to explain.
But what that means is we are currently at that point of stepping into the unknown. We don't know what Ella's timescales and timetable, that's the word I was looking for, is going to look like per se over the next little while. So we are going to be...
The project will be relevant.
Yeah, we will be making things. It's not us prepping you for us to end, but we are annoyingly, again, in a state of flux where we're not quite sure what our recording schedule is going to be able to look like over the next little while. But there are reasons to be hopeful. There are reasons to hope that potentially Ella's PhD actually makes life a little easier for us in some other ways. So, yeah, sit tight. Be ready for a new thing. 2025, hopefully. It's 200 years of the railways. Let's make it another good year for Rails to Nowhere as well.
So thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed this little deep dive into an obscure company.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.
Goodbye. Thank you for listening to Rails to Nowhere. This episode was written and edited by Eleanor Ashton and based on her MA thesis on the Jersey Railways. Irrelevant contributions were made by myself, Simon Sartis & Co. during our recording session, and this podcast is supported by our patrons over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. If you want to support what we're doing, you can do so over there for as little as £2 per month. And a big thank you to Valkyrie Lemons, our £10 and above patron.